It wasn't on the official calendar. Karoline Leavitt's name didn't appear on the speaker list, and yet, somehow, her presence had already sent a chill through the room. The auditorium at Georgetown University had filled early that morning, students, faculty, media crews, even a few diplomatic staffers in the back rows. All were waiting for the much-publicized Unity in American Politics symposium hosted by Vice President Kamala Harris. The irony didn't escape Karoline. She hadn't been invited. She had been warned. 3 days earlier, a student organization sympathetic to Karoline's message had attempted to list her as an alternate panelist. The request had been denied, quietly, formally, strategically. But Karoline showed up anyway. She sat in the back row, blazer sharp, her signature cross necklace just barely visible above the collar. She didn't flinch when aides whispered to each other. She didn't react when the moderator's eyes widened in her direction. She didn't need an official name card to make herself known. All she needed was timing and the truth. As Kamala Harris took the stage, the applause was immediate but thin. Cameras clicked. Aides flanked the sides. Harris began her address with rehearsed calm. "We gather today to prove that voices from every background can come together." Karoline leaned forward slightly. Then came the moment. Harris paused, scanning the rows. Her eyes stopped on Karoline. The vice president's tone shifted ever so slightly. "But we also must be cautious of disinformation," she added. "Of those who seek to inflame division rather than promote unity. Some of them may even be here today." A hush fell. Karoline didn't move. She didn't blink. The audience glanced toward the back. Someone stood up, an aide, clipboard in hand. He leaned into Harris's ear. Her eyes narrowed. Then she spoke 3 words into her mic, clipped and firm. "Get security ready." The crowd shifted, murmurs rising like heat off pavement. But Karoline Leavitt didn't wait for security to arrive. She stood, straightened her blazer, and walked slowly toward the microphone stand at the center aisle. She hadn't been invited to speak, but she wasn't leaving until she did. The clicking of Karoline Leavitt's heels echoed louder than anyone expected. Not because of the acoustics, but because no one dared move. The students in the front row turned their heads, unsure if they were witnessing a stunt or a historic moment. Faculty members whispered to one another in frantic fragments, "Is she on the program? Did someone approve this? Is security even moving?" But Karoline kept walking. Each step forward felt like a strike against the unspoken rules that governed that room. This wasn't her turf. She hadn't been invited. And yet, she was taking the center aisle like it belonged to her. There was no press pass around her neck, no staffer guiding her forward. Just conviction and a message that was no longer willing to wait. From the stage, Kamala Harris stiffened. Her smile evaporated. She leaned toward her chief aide, who whispered something urgent. The vice president's mic was still hot, and the words, "Remove her now," crackled faintly through the speakers. That's when 2 suited security officers began moving, cautiously, toward Karoline. Still, she didn't stop. She reached the front of the auditorium and turned, not to face Kamala, but to face the audience. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes scanned the room, and her voice when it came wasn't loud, but clear enough to pierce the quiet panic. "If I'm such a threat," Karoline said calmly, "then maybe you're afraid of what I have to say." The tension snapped. Gasps rippled through the hall. One of the officers hesitated, visibly unsure. The other glanced toward the stage, waiting for a signal. But none came. Kamala was frozen, caught between protocol and optics. If she gave the nod to physically remove a young woman for merely speaking, the headlines would write themselves. Karoline stepped onto the small platform between the front row and the stage. She didn't need the vice president's podium. She didn't need a spotlight. She only needed a minute. And in that minute, the entire room and the entire country would hear something no staffer could redact, no microphone could mute, and no political firewall could contain. But first, she had one question. Facing Kamala Harris directly, Karoline asked, Why is truth treated like trespassing? For a second, it was like no one breathed. The question, why is truth treated like trespassing, hung in the air like smoke after a shot. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even rhetorical. It was a line delivered with such calm clarity that even the security officers hesitated. Karoline Leavitt stood in the glow of the overhead lights, not the stage spotlights, but the raw light of 1,000 smartphone cameras that had been raised instinctively. Students were filming, journalists were scribbling, and Kamala Harris, still seated behind her podium, was recalibrating. She leaned into her mic. "Miss Leavitt, this is a closed event. You are not authorized to speak." But Karoline didn't flinch. "You just called for unity. Is unity only for those who agree with you?" A ripple ran through the room, half gasp, half awe. It wasn't the kind of line you recover from with a press release. This wasn't a tweet. This was live, and Kamala knew it. "This isn't your platform," the vice president replied sharply. "You were not invited." Karoline nodded slowly. "And yet, here I am, which should tell you something." She stepped forward closer to the small mic stand at the front aisle, her voice lifting just enough to carry across the auditorium. "I didn't come here to be provocative. I came here because for too long, one side of this country has been told to sit down, shut up, and smile through the censorship. I've done all three. I'm done now." Behind her, the security guards waited, still unsure of their next move. Kamala Harris's team looked to her, but she didn't speak. Removing Karoline now would turn the moment into a political firestorm. Letting her continue risked even more. It was a no-win scenario, unless Karoline imploded. But she didn't. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This," she said, holding it up, "is a copy of the letter sent to the student organization that tried to get me on this panel. It doesn't cite any policy. It doesn't give a reason. Just a quiet no. That's not governance. That's gatekeeping." A voice from the back yelled, "Let her talk!" Another followed, "We came to hear everyone." Karoline folded the paper in half and tucked it into the side of the podium. "I'll speak quickly," she said, looking straight at Kamala. "Unless you'd like to stop me in front of all these cameras." Kamala Harris didn't answer, so Karoline Leavitt began. Karoline Leavitt's voice was steady, but there was fire underneath. "You say this event is about unity," she began, scanning the faces in front of her. "But what you really mean is conformity. You want applause, not accountability." The room wasn't just quiet, it was tense. Every pair of eyes was either locked on Karoline or flickering nervously toward the stage. Kamala Harris's hands were clenched tightly on the sides of her lectern. Behind her, aides whispered into earpieces, but no one moved. The cameras were still rolling. The damage, if it was damage, was already happening. Karoline raised the letter again, then folded it into her blazer. "They didn't just deny me a seat at the table," she said. "They denied the students who invited me. They denied open debate. And they denied the idea that this country is strong enough to handle disagreement without fear." A few heads nodded in the crowd. She continued. "They told me I didn't qualify to sit here because I'm divisive, because I might inflame. What they really meant is, I think differently. I challenge their scripts. I don't take my lines from a party-approved teleprompter. That's what scares them." From the stage, Kamala finally leaned forward again. "This isn't the place for a political ambush," she said flatly, her tone clipped. Karoline didn't miss a beat. "It's only an ambush if someone wasn't prepared for the truth." That line hit. There was a sharp, involuntary gasp near the media section. One of the journalists lowered her camera, stunned. Even the security detail shifted, unsure whether they were watching a disruption or history being made. Karoline stepped to the center of the aisle. "I'll be brief," she said, raising her hand slightly. "But since I'm apparently so dangerous, let me tell you what I would have said if I had been invited like everyone else." She took a breath. The room held it with her. I would have said this: America doesn't need curated conversations. It needs courageous ones. We've raised a generation afraid to speak, not because they have nothing to say, but because they know they'll be punished for saying it. Murmurs now, stronger than before. I was told to stay in the back. I walked to the front, not because I want attention, but because someone had to go first. She locked eyes with Kamala Harris. And apparently that someone had to be me. The silence in the room had changed. It was no longer the hush of confusion or disapproval. It had become focus, attention. The kind of silence that only followed a shift in power. Karoline Leavitt didn't need the microphone anymore. Her voice had found its rhythm. Her confidence, once read by some as audacity, now sounded like authority. I wasn't born with a political dynasty behind me, she continued. I didn't inherit media networks, elite donor circles, or legacy platforms, but I was raised to speak plainly, fight fairly, and never flinch when the truth makes people uncomfortable. A low murmur of agreement echoed from somewhere on the left side of the auditorium. Karoline paused just enough to let it settle. I came here today because someone has to challenge the theater we've built around politics, where we pretend to debate, pretend to listen, and pretend that we're diverse so long as everyone agrees. Kamala Harris shifted visibly behind the podium. Her smile had vanished, her posture now guarded, calculating. She was a woman accustomed to being the most powerful voice in any room, but this moment wasn't scripted for her, and she knew it. Karoline looked directly into the camera of a journalist live streaming from the side aisle. "You know what makes people like me dangerous?" she said. "It's not that we disrupt events, it's that we disrupt narratives." Click, click, click. The flash of still cameras punctuated her words. I was told to wait, to ask permission, to be silent until it was my time. But if I waited for permission from people who never planned to give it, I'd still be in the back row. A student in the front, nervous but inspired, stood up. Another followed, then a third. Karoline turned slightly to address them, not with ego, but purpose. You're told to listen, nod, and clap. But I'm telling you, if your voice makes the powerful uncomfortable, you don't owe them silence. You owe them honesty. A round of hesitant applause began to build, fragile, unsure, then louder. Kamala Harris lifted her mic again. "Miss Leavitt, this event must return to the program." Karoline stepped back toward the center, still holding her ground. "You're right, Madam Vice President," she said coolly. "Let's talk about the program. How it was designed to feature only one kind of voice." Another wave of applause, this time from the back of the room. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't need to. This wasn't about her. It was about the fear in that room slowly turning into something braver. And she wasn't finished yet. From that moment on, it wasn't just a room full of students and staff anymore. It was a broadcast. The live streams were spreading like wildfire. Conservative outlets, independent journalists, even mainstream media began resharing clips. Twitter, no, X, had #sign Karoline Leavitt trending within minutes. Screenshots of her standing alone in the aisle, blazer sharp, cross necklace gleaming, began circulating with captions like, "She showed up." They tried to shut her down. She spoke anyway. And Kamala Harris knew it. She shifted again behind the podium, eyes darting to her press secretary, who now had a phone in hand, clearly receiving updates in real time. The administration hadn't planned for this, not for an organic eruption of attention that couldn't be choreographed or shut off with a commercial break. Karoline stood tall in the center aisle. "I'm not afraid to be called disruptive," she said. "If disruption means honesty, if it means waking people up to the way real dialogue has been replaced by rehearsed lines and protected dogma, then yes, I'll own that word." More applause now, louder, clearer. What started as a fringe moment had become an undeniable shift in tone. The audience wasn't booing her, they were listening. Some were nodding, Some, even in suits, clapped behind notebooks and tablets. Karoline continued, "This isn't just about me. You may disagree with everything I stand for, that's fine. But if the only answer to disagreement is silence, then we don't have a democracy. We have a theater, and you've turned that stage into a filter." Kamala Harris's voice finally returned, controlled but strained. "You are not accredited to speak today. This platform belongs to the invited panel." Karoline didn't even look at her this time. Her eyes scanned the room instead. She spoke directly to the students. "And how many of you were invited to question power?" she asked. "Or were you just told what's acceptable to clap for?" That was the line. A spontaneous standing ovation burst from the left side of the hall. Not everyone joined, but enough did that it couldn't be ignored. Phones were up. Broadcasts were clipping. The White House communication team would later scramble to frame the moment as unauthorized, disruptive, and outside the event's scope. But none of that mattered now because Karoline Leavitt had just hijacked a national narrative, not with a protest, not with a stunt, but with one voice, one question, and one unshakable refusal to sit back down. And she still had more to say. Karoline Leavitt didn't need a stage. The entire room had already become one. The podium, the chairs, the security officers who still hovered by the exits, they were all part of a scene now far beyond anyone's control. And in the center of it all stood a woman who refused to be edited out of the conversation. "You know why they called security?" Carolina asked, eyes now fixed on the vice president. "Not because I was a threat to safety, but because I was a threat to the script." Her voice had a sharpened edge now, not angry but undeniable. The kind of voice that didn't rise to fill the room. It cut through it. "They say it's about democracy. But democracy doesn't need protection from opinions, it needs protection from censorship. And that's what this is." Kamala Harris leaned into her mic again. "Miss Leavitt, your actions are inappropriate and disrespectful." Karoline cut in, without raising her volume. "What's inappropriate is banning dissent and calling it unity." Gasps again. But they weren't out of shock anymore. They were out of recognition. Karoline turned slightly toward the students seated in the middle rows. "Some of you don't agree with me. That's fine. You're not supposed to. That's the point. Real freedom doesn't demand uniformity. It demands courage." A student clapped once, then another, then a third. It wasn't an ovation, not yet, but it was a signal. Karoline took another breath. "When I was in high school, I was taught that leaders listen, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. But today, the message is, fall in line or get erased." Kamala tried again to reclaim the narrative. "You're grandstanding," she said. "This event was never about you." Karoline looked at her for the first time in several minutes. Number It was supposed to be about the future. But the future doesn't belong to the ones who silence voices. They belong to the ones brave enough to speak up. She stepped slightly to the side and extended her arm toward the audience, not to command attention, but to acknowledge it. "This moment doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every student who's been told their beliefs are too dangerous for campus, every young journalist who's been warned to stick to the party line, every American who's ever been afraid to post what they really think." And then, lowering her voice but not her conviction, she added, "You don't need permission to speak. You need a backbone." That did it. The applause now was real, uncoordinated, raw. The moderators shut off their mics. Kamala whispered something to an aide, but it was too late. Karoline had just turned their carefully managed event into a mirror, reflecting everything they didn't want seen. Karoline Leavitt didn't yell. She didn't storm the stage. She didn't chant or disrupt with chaos. She simply spoke and refused to stop speaking. And that, somehow, was the most radical act in the room. "I didn't come here to perform," she said, scanning the faces now staring with unblinking intensity. "I came here to expose something." She held up the original letter again, the one that had quietly denied her access to the stage. The ink looked harmless, the words polite, But Karoline wasn't fooled, and neither was the crowd anymore. "This right here," she said, "is how the powerful keep their hands clean. They don't ban you outright. They just quietly erase you from the list, send a formal email, and hope you take the hint." A pause. "But I don't take hints." Laughter. Not mocking, supportive. And with it, something shifted. Suddenly, Karoline wasn't just a rogue voice interrupting an event. She was a representative of every student who'd been silenced, every speaker disinvited, every uncomfortable idea shoved off the agenda. She turned again to Kamala Harris. "You called for security, but what are you actually protecting? Students or your narrative?" The vice president didn't respond. Her eyes flicked toward the live feed cameras, now trained entirely on Karoline. "This is the part they didn't plan for," Karoline said, motioning toward the crowd. "The part where someone speaks without a handler, where someone tells the truth without waiting for permission or polling data." She stepped back slightly. "You wanted a conversation about unity, but unity without truth is just tyranny in disguise." That was the line. Every camera in the room caught it. Newsrooms would replay it within the hour. Conservative media blasted it across every platform. Even progressive outlets, some reluctantly, covered the moment. Not because they supported her, but because they couldn't ignore what had just happened. Karoline Leavitt had walked into a room where no one wanted her voice heard. And now the world couldn't stop listening to it. The security guards? They had stopped moving, frozen. The moderators? Silent. Kamala Harris? Visibly rattled. But Karoline? She stepped back, folded the letter in half, and tucked it into her bag. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had already raised the bar. Within minutes of Karoline Leavitt finishing her last sentence, the fallout had already begun. Not from the audience, not from the students, but from the institutions scrambling behind the scenes. The university's press team issued a terse statement online. "Unauthorized disruption during Vice President Harris's address, not representative of Yale's values." But it was too late for press language to bury what had already gone viral. Karoline's impromptu speech was everywhere, clipped, reposted, hashtagged. By sunset, it had been translated into 5 languages and subtitled in 10. The Daily Wire praised her. CNN tried to contextualize her. MSNBC debated whether she should have been removed immediately. And yet even the critics had to admit she had struck a chord. Karoline herself wasn't hiding. As the security guards slowly backed away, realizing that physically removing her now would cause more problems than it would solve, she calmly stepped away from the center aisle and returned to the back of the hall. Not escorted, not pushed. She walked on her own terms. From the stage, Kamala Harris tried to salvage the event. "Let us remember," she said, voice composed but thin, "this is a place for productive dialogue, not disruption." But no one was listening. Not really. Students in the front were already showing Karoline the videos they had taken. Others were texting friends in other states, pointing them to the live stream timestamp. Professors whispered to one another about the unexpected clarity of her words. And Karoline? She didn't celebrate. She didn't post a victory tweet. She sat down in the second-to-last row, pulled out a notebook, and jotted something quietly as if it were just another Tuesday. But behind her, the entire building buzzed like a storm had passed and rewired the air. Backstage, Kamala's aides were panicking. They had tried to erase a voice, and instead, they had amplified it to the world. Some staffers suggested pulling the live stream. Others warned against it. It would only make it worse. And then it hit them. Karoline hadn't just stolen a moment, she had seized the narrative, and with it she'd exposed how fragile their version of control really was. The media frenzy didn't slow, it intensified. By the next morning, Karoline Leavitt's name was plastered across every platform. Conservative anchors praised her as the future. Independent podcasters called her speech the most fearless moment in recent political memory. Even those who disagreed with her message were forced to admit She had done what most wouldn't dare. She had challenged power directly and didn't blink. But the moment's real weight wasn't online. It was in the inboxes of student groups across America. Emails flooded into conservative, libertarian, and even moderate organizations on campuses nationwide. How did she do it? What did she say? Can we invite her? A whisper turned into a signal. A signal turned into a movement. At Yale, some faculty called for an apology. Others defended free speech. The university found itself trapped between reputations, one it had crafted and one it had just confirmed. Karoline didn't issue a press release. She didn't go on a victory tour. Instead, a single clip from her appearance, just 13 seconds long, circulated more than anything else. It showed her standing alone, shoulders squared, saying one quiet sentence that echoed far beyond that room. "You don't need permission to speak the truth." That line appeared on posters, t-shirts, headlines, even graffiti in Berkeley, scrawled in red, "Truth doesn't need a microphone, Karoline Leavitt." Kamala Harris, when asked about the incident a week later, gave a short, clipped response. "Everyone has the right to their opinion. That doesn't mean every opinion belongs at the table." But it didn't matter, because Karoline had made her own table, right there in the middle of a room that tried to shut her out, and millions had pulled up a chair. The moment was never supposed to belong to her, but she took it anyway. And once the world heard her voice, they couldn't unhear it. They told her to sit down. They tried to cut the mic. They even called security, but Karoline Leavitt didn't raise her voice. She raised the truth. In a world where silence is rewarded and courage is punished, one woman stood up and made the whole room listen. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't follow their script. She wrote her own. And when Kamala Harris called for the guards, Karoline gave the speech they never wanted aired. The message is clear now. You don't need to be invited to the table when you are the message. The mic wasn't hers, but the moment was, and the world is still talking about it.